You know, it's one of those things you wonder about. What happens after a massive international aid project actually ends? Does all that good work keep going, or does it just fizzle out? Well, today we're going to try and solve a fascinating puzzle that involves decades of work and billions of dollars spent trying to improve Indonesia's education system. First, let's just get our heads around the numbers here. We are talking about $6 billion. I mean, that is a staggering amount of money invested by international donors in education projects in Indonesia over more than 50 years. The goal, of course, was to create real, lasting improvements for schools and for students.
And that leads us right to the heart of the matter, the big question: did it actually work? More to the point, once the funding stopped and the experts went home, did the benefits from all that investment actually last? That's really the core of the mystery we're looking into today.
All right, so to start digging into this, let's look at the paper trail. How was success even measured in the first place? Well, when these projects wrapped up, the donors filed their final reports. And what they reported, on paper at least, it looked pretty good.
I mean, look at this. At first glance, the results seem fantastic. According to the donors' own end-of-project reports, a massive 82% of these projects were considered successful. You'd look at that and think, mission accomplished, right? But you know, success at the finish line, that's one thing. Long-term impact, that's a whole other story.
Okay, so let's be super clear on one really important word here: sustainability. When we talk about that, we're really asking a pretty simple question. Do the good things that came from a project keep going after the project itself is officially over? It's the difference between a quick fix and real, lasting change. And this is where the official story starts to get really interesting, because it begins to split from the reality on the ground. When researchers started digging deeper, not at those final reports, but at what actually stuck around years later, a totally different picture began to form. So here's the first clue. You see this gap, right? At the end of the projects, donors figured that about 59% were likely to be sustainable. But when they went back and looked at the handful of projects they actually checked on later, only 52% had really sustained their benefits. And that little drop? Believe me, it's hiding a much bigger issue. And here is the real kicker. Get this, that 52% figure, it comes from just 23 projects. Out of the 114 they studied, that's it. That's the tiny fraction that anyone ever went back to evaluate for their real-world, long-term impact. This suggests that for the vast majority of this multi-billion-dollar investment, nobody was even checking to see if the changes actually stuck. So what's going on here? Why the disconnect? Why would projects that look so good on paper just fade away? Well, the research points to a really fundamental mismatch in what was being prioritized. It really boils down to this. Project success was often judged on management stuff. Was it on time? Was it on budget? But the core educational goals, the whole reason for the project, were often pushed to the side. Better teaching, better curriculum, whether students were actually learning more, that just wasn't the main way they were measuring success. And that kind of thinking created some pretty big problems. The evidence shows that donors just weren't really committed to planning for what happens after they leave. Crucially, local ownership, getting the community to feel like the project was theirs, was often overlooked. And maybe the most frustrating part of all is that there are proven, well-known ways to make these changes last, and they were frequently just ignored. This quote from the research really just hits the nail on the head. Basically, what they're saying is the problem wasn't just keeping the benefits going in one school. The evidence for spreading that success to other places, for scaling it up, was even weaker. The good ideas just weren't catching on. That ripple effect wasn't happening. Okay, so that's a pretty tough diagnosis of the problem. But what's the solution? The good news is the research doesn't just point out what went wrong, it also lays out a clear path forward for making sure future aid actually makes a lasting difference. It comes down to 3 key strategies. First, stop dropping in one-size-fits-all technical fixes. You have to really, truly understand the local culture. Second, don't just put a Band-Aid on the symptoms. Do the hard work of digging down to find the root causes of the problems. And third, and this one is so powerful, find what's already working on the ground, in the local communities, and figure out how to build on that homegrown success. So you can see the theme here, right? It's powerful and it's pretty clear. Technical solutions and management checklists just aren't enough. The most promising path forward is through a much deeper, more respectful engagement with the social and cultural reality of the places these projects are trying to help. So what's the final verdict on that 50-50 sustainability rate? The research calls it mediocre. And here's why that's such a tough judgment. It's not because the problems were too hard to solve. It's because donors often neglected proven strategies and available knowledge that could have made the results so much better. The tools were there, they just weren't being used. And all of this leaves us with a final, really provocative question. When you're dealing with these incredibly complex challenges, what some people call wicked problems, is a 50% success rate a sign of failure? Or, in our complicated world, is it maybe the best we can realistically hope for? It's a crucial question for anyone who wants to make a real, lasting difference.